Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today we're diving into one of the most bizarre and overlooked events of World War II, a battle where Americans and Germans actually fought together against the SS. Yes, you heard that right. Former enemies, side by side, rifles raised, defending a medieval castle full of French VIPs. But before we get to that showdown, we have to understand the setting. Picture it, May of 1945. Nazi Germany is crumbling like a rotten empire held together by rusted bolts. Hitler is dead, Berlin has fallen, and with the collapse of Nazi high command, the entire chain of control starts to disintegrate. Imagine a machine suddenly losing its gears, chaos spreads in every direction. US forces are pushing in from the west, liberating towns and tearing through Nazi defenses. Meanwhile, from the east, the Soviet Union is steamrolling its way toward Berlin with raw, brutal force. These two massive military forces are converging on the heart of the Reich, like the jaws of a vice closing in on a dying regime. And in between them, confusion, desperation, and a whole lot of abandoned Nazi infrastructure. What happens when centralized control collapses overnight? You get a power vacuum, abandoned fortresses, empty command posts, entire prison camps with no orders, no leadership, and no real idea what to do next. Austria, in particular, becomes a strange in-between zone, caught in the wreckage of a falling empire, with no clear authority and no one in charge. And it's in that power vacuum that our story begins to take shape. A crumbling regime, a castle turned prison, and the most unlikely alliance of the entire war. Now let's talk about Castle Itter. Nestled in the Austrian region of Tyrol, Castle Itter might look like the kind of place you'd visit on a postcard tour, a majestic, remote, perched above a scenic valley. But by the final days of the war, this medieval hunting lodge had become something far more surreal. It had been taken over by the SS and transformed into a prison. But not just any prison. This was a detention center for the elite, an exclusive, high-stakes holding pen for some of France's most prominent figures. Who were the inmates? Think of a political who's who, two former prime ministers of France, top military leaders, even the sister of Charles de Gaulle. These weren't nameless prisoners of war. These were VIPs, symbols of French identity, power, and resistance. And what's truly eerie is the setting itself. Imagine walking through stone halls built for royalty or nobles, and realizing those same halls are now wired with SS guards and echo with the tension of political captivity. A place once designed for aristocratic leisure had become a gilded cage, luxury twisted into confinement. This castle, in many ways, became a paradox. On the outside, it looked like something out of a fairy tale. But on the inside, it represented the strange and desperate final phase of Nazi control. The regime had lost its grip on the front lines, but still held on to symbols of power, of revenge, of propaganda. And that's what Castle Itter had become. But as the war collapsed around it, the castle would soon become something even stranger, not just a prison, but a battlefield. So here we are, Castle Itter, occupied by high-profile French prisoners, surrounded by the crumbling shell of the Third Reich. But with Hitler dead and the Nazi hierarchy disintegrating, something remarkable starts to happen. The guards vanish. As Allied forces close in, SS units begin deserting their posts. At Castle Itter, the SS simply leaves. No final orders, no handover, no reinforcements, just silence. The castle's prisoners, once heavily guarded by one of the most feared organizations in Nazi Germany, are suddenly unguarded. Imagine being locked in a cell one day and then waking up to find the keys on the floor and your captors gone. That eerie silence wasn't freedom, it was danger. Because with the SS retreating in chaos, no one knew who might show up next. And so, the French captives, politicians, generals, and statesmen did something few could have predicted. They prepared to fight. With weapons smuggled in or hastily acquired, they started organizing their own defense. These were men who had been prisoners for months, some for years, but now they were taking their fate into their own hands. For the first time in a long time, they weren't waiting on someone else to liberate them. They were stepping up to protect themselves and each other. But perhaps the strangest turn of all was who came to help them. Enter Major Joseph Gangl, a former officer of the German Wehrmacht. Now think about that for a second, a German officer who had fought for the Nazis, choosing to turn against the SS, to fight alongside the Americans, in order to defend French prisoners. If that sounds like fiction, it's not. Gangl made contact with US forces, specifically with Lieutenant Jack Lee of the 23rd Tank Battalion. And together, they forged an alliance, Americans, Germans, and French elites, united by a single goal, protect the castle from an incoming SS assault. This wasn't just a collapse of command, it was a collapse of ideology. The boundaries of allegiance were disintegrating right alongside the Nazi system itself, and in that moral vacuum, people began to choose, some for themselves, some for others. Now the question becomes, what happens when the SS tries to reclaim what's left? Now this is where history takes a turn so unexpected, you'd think it was a movie script that got rejected for being too unbelievable. The date is May 5, 1945, just days before the official end of World War II in Europe. At Castle Itter, a tiny force of defenders prepares for battle. On one side, we have 14 American GIs, a handful of defected German Wehrmacht soldiers, and the castle's own inmates, high-profile French captives, now armed and ready to fight. They even had one Sherman tank positioned outside the gate, but spoiler alert, it would get taken out early in the fight. On the other side, a battalion of SS troops, fanatically loyal, desperate, and still fighting for a lost cause. And they were coming for the castle. This was no symbolic skirmish. It was a real battle. Bullets flying, shells exploding, and the defenders, this ragtag coalition of Americans, Germans, and French VIPs, holding their ground for hours under relentless fire. Just take that in for a moment. Enemies from opposite sides of a world war fighting side by side in a last-ditch defense of a medieval fortress. History rarely hands you irony this poetic, and at the center of it all was Major Joseph Gangl. This man, once a part of Hitler's army, now stood in front of a French prisoner, protecting him not out of duty, not for a paycheck, but out of conscience. And in one final act of defiance against the regime he had once served, Gangl was shot and killed while shielding that man from sniper fire. Let that sink in. A German officer died defending a French prisoner alongside American troops. If that doesn't rattle our tidy categories of good guys and bad guys, I don't know what will. Thankfully, reinforcements arrived just in time. The castle was held. The prisoners survived. But more importantly, this bizarre, small-scale battle became one of the most remarkable examples of moral courage and cooperation in the entire war. So what does it mean? What do we learn when enemies become allies, when prisoners become soldiers, and when systems fall apart? So, what are we really looking at here? Castle Itter wasn't just some oddball footnote in World War II history. It was a case study in what happens when systems break down and individuals step up. When the machinery of control, SS chains of command, Nazi ideology, centralized orders, collapsed, it didn't result in pure chaos. It revealed something deeper, something human. Let's start with the obvious. When ideology fell away, morality re-emerged. It wasn't party loyalty or national allegiance that drove people's actions anymore. It was values. Joseph Gangl didn't have to help the French prisoners. Jack Lee didn't have to trust a German officer. The French prisoners didn't have to pick up rifles. But they all did. Not because a rulebook told them to, but because the moment demanded it. You see, when you remove the scaffolding of propaganda, power, and top-down control, you often find that people still know right from wrong. The decisions made at Castle Itter weren't driven by orders. They were driven by conscience, by courage, by the very thing authoritarian systems always try to suppress, individual agency. And there's something else here, too. When central planning fails, when a regime can no longer feed its own ideology or enforce its control, its entire framework collapses like a house of cards. That's exactly what happened in the final days of the Third Reich. The SS fled not because they were tactically outmatched, but because they had nothing left to believe in. No structure, no future, no direction. And what filled the void? Improvised alliances, decentralized action, people choosing to act not because they were told to, but because they believed it was right. This is the paradox of collapse. It's terrifying, yes, but it's also revealing. It shows us who people really are when they aren't being watched. It strips away the uniforms, the salutes, the slogans, and reveals character. And in a world still wrestling with the tension between top-down control and bottom-up action, the lessons from Castle Itter are as relevant now as they were in 1945. But we're not done yet. So here we are, at the end of one of the strangest and most inspiring battles in modern history. Castle Itter wasn't a grand theatre of war. It wasn't a turning point in military strategy, but it was something arguably more profound. It was a moment where history peeled back the curtain and showed us what happens when labels dissolve and humanity rises to the surface. Think about it. A Nazi-built prison guarded by SS officers becomes a haven defended by Americans, defecting Germans, and their former French prisoners. That sentence alone defies logic, but in the wreckage of war, with propaganda burned away and centralized control in free fall, people were finally free to choose. And what they chose was each other. That's what makes this story matter today, because we still live in a world full of systems, political, economic, ideological, each one shaping our choices, drawing hard lines between us and them, between loyalty and treason, between order and chaos. But when those systems break, or when they fail to deliver justice, it's the individual that steps in to write the next chapter. And Castle Itter is proof of that. A place where the collapse of one of the most oppressive regimes in history didn't lead to a vacuum of violence, but to a moment of unity, sacrifice, and defiance. It's a reminder that sometimes, when the world seems most upside down, that's when people are most capable of doing what's right. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Truth Behind History. And if you want to dive even deeper into the stories they didn't want you to learn in school, check out my book, History They Tried to Erase. The link is in the description below. We've got more stories like this, stories that dig beneath the surface and shine a light on the strange, forgotten, and powerful moments that shaped our world. So stick around, because history has a lot more to tell us.